Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unit 4. We are going to be talking a little bit more about conflict between persons today. We read chapters 1 through 7 in this week's reading, and I'd love to get into some more details with you. But first, I just want to check in with you on what's due for this week. So last week, you did the midterm, which congratulations, that's done. And we're continuing to rapidly move forward to the end of class. So if you have any questions or any kind of continued ongoing questions or concerns about homework, please reach out to me as soon as possible. If you have any assignments that are overdue or missing, it's really important that you connect with me if you have not already done so. I want to make sure that you have what you need as we end the course here. So again, as always, you have the items due that are on the syllabus. So this includes your reading, your video, the discussion boards, your C&Qs, and the continued engagement here. I want you to continue to be thinking about your final paper, please. You've probably seen this in the syllabus, but today we're going to be going through the reading that we have. But you can also see in a video that's now posted over to the course website, there's a specific introduction of the final paper, and I go through a little bit more of what you need to successfully complete that, so you can be thinking about it. We've got 2 weeks until this is due here, and so it's important to be thinking about this and preparing for it. That's coming up again here at the end of the final exam week. So if you have questions about that, please reach out to me. It's, again, not too early to be thinking about that. That's important to be doing as we get to the end of the course. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive into our conversation here for Unit 4. What I did for this unit was to select, and I'm going to share my screen as I'm talking with you here, but I selected a part of our text that we were reading for the week that is I think I hope it's helpful. So this is coming mostly from chapter 1, and it is also really concerned with kind of introducing the topics in this book. So we have chapters 1 through 7 that were part of your assignment, but this lecture, because we can't cover all of that content here, is really going specifically over the content from chapter 1, because I think this is really helpful for you as you get into the reading and as you're looking at the scope of this book and this text. This is one of my favorite communication textbooks. It dives into what it means to handle conflict and difficult conversations in a way that is respectful of other people and is attentive to learning. So themes that we've been talking about throughout this class, that won't be a stranger to you. However, this book is a little bit more academically dense. So just a warning for you, it's using some language that's a little heavier, a little more theoretical, and it's less of kind of a popular press reading and more of an academic textbook. So this will be helpful for you as you're getting ready for the next semester. Maybe you're a first-year student in college, or maybe you've been around college kind of teaching a curriculum for a long time, and this is kind of something you're used to. Either way, this is a good kind of preparing sort of text for some things that you might encounter in some of your other classes. So if you're having any questions or any thing that comes up as you're reading it, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help you as you're navigating that. This requires a different kind of reading than the texts that we had before this. Those texts are a little easier to get through, and this one is a little harder, and that's okay. If you have questions, just reach out, all right? So let's go ahead and dive into this. This is chapter 1, and it's giving us an idea of why conflict is important to handle well and how that ties into communication ethics. So at the very beginning of the text, the authors inform us that conflict is inevitable because we live in an era of competing goods, is the term that's used here. So backing up and explaining this a little bit here. Competing goods is language that comes from the field of communication ethics. Communication ethics, and we may have talked about this a little bit earlier in class, is the study of different kinds of ways of seeing the world. It's different ways of protecting and promoting what is thought of as what's good in life, right? So there are different kinds of ethical orientations. There are different ways of protecting and promoting the good. What is the good life? What is right? What is best? Right? We've talked about this a little bit in class, but when we get into those moments of we start looking at communication ethics, we start living in the world around us, conflict comes up because we have competing goods. So this simply means that we value different things, right? I think of my relationship with some of my siblings this week. We're focusing a little bit more on family communication, and I think of some of the competing goods that I have in some of my family communication, whether it's with my siblings or with cousins or kind of other family, right? There are things that we hold differently, right? So in the case of my family, I have a different kind of political background or a different political set of persuasions or beliefs than some of my family does. And we have different competing goods. For some, there are some things that are really important when you look at politics. And for me, that differs then from what I think sometimes. And so you get into these places where there's competing goods, or even just as simple as when I was growing up. My dad really valued competition and kind of teasing. He's an oldest sibling, and so he really enjoys kind of one of the ways he expresses love is teasing, right? And good-natured kind of poking at people. And my mom does not value that at all, right? She is someone who really likes peace and harmony, and she can't understand competition. She wants everybody to win, and she's just the sweetest human being in the whole world. But sometimes you get these competing goods that go back and forth, right? And we see that in individuals, but we also see that in, as we've kind of talked throughout the class, in like faith traditions and political beliefs. When we're looking at the family, though, especially, those become very personal. Barnett Pearce and Littlejohn, 1997, they're both really important in the development of a lot of really interesting kind of theories around the idea of meaning and how we coordinate meaning and manage that. They have this concept of social worlds. And the idea of a social world is that we build the space we live in. It's constructed, right? The social worlds that we live in are ones that are constructed by our actions, by our belief systems, the way we treat people, and the way we engage with them. So not only are we living in our social worlds, but we're actively building them. And when we're in relationship with people, those social worlds can sometimes collide. So it's not just that I disagree with someone, it's that our whole worldviews and kind of identities come into conflict with each other. I don't know if you've seen this before, but it can happen in a lot of different places. In my hometown, when I was growing up, I lived in a small rural town in the middle of Oregon. And my growing up was mostly around people who looked like me and believed like me, right? But this kind of weird reality was that I lived in a town where I didn't encounter a lot of difference, but there was a lot of difference. I think that the town itself is maybe 60% Caucasian and at least 30%, 25% Latinx or Hispanic. And so you have these two different cultures, these two different social worlds in some ways that usually there wasn't a lot of overlap between them, but there would be times where these social worlds would collide, these different cultures, these different languages, these different ways of seeing the world. I would go sometimes into the Mexican bakery down the street, and they have some of the best baked goods. And I couldn't talk with the person who was my cashier. I only spoke English, and I think they only spoke Spanish. And there was this colliding of our social worlds, this difference, and we made it through okay, right? I was able to point to what I wanted and say gracias and be really thankful and trying to communicate with hand gestures, and they were doing the same thing. And but you can see the world we created the two worlds that we lived in were quite different, and sadly, right there, for me at least. And there are good things about being in our own world that we've created, but sometimes it can be limiting. For me, growing up, I wasn't exposed to lots of different worlds around me, and I look back on that and I'm kind of sad for younger Preston, right? Because there's so much richness to being able to experience difference and culture and those kinds of things. So the reality is that sometimes these social worlds, they'll collide, and that's a big that story kind of shows these big different cultural divides. But the reality is we're always constructing our social worlds, and they're all a little different, and there are these collisions that are happening all around us that come into contact with each other. So postmodernity is an important word, and it's going to appear in this book multiple times. Postmodernity is simply looking at this idea of it's a state that we're in now. It's like a kind of dividing line in history where postmodernity is that we no longer have these commonly held narrative agreements that most people agree on, right? If you went out of your house, let's say you lived back in Middle Ages England, right? And you stepped out of your cottage door and you turned to your neighbor. Well, you're probably on a farm or something to begin with. But if you were around the people that were around you, chances are they likely had a similar religion to you, probably looked really similar, probably spoke the same language, probably had a lot of the same cultural practices and norms, celebrated the same sort of things, were afraid of similar things. But now, if you step outside your door, if you're living in the United States, or you're living in New York City or LA, or here even in Pittsburgh, chances are you're probably going to be meeting people from a lot of different backgrounds. Even in the PhD program that I'm in, I will meet with my friends, and I have a friend who is a Muslim, a friend who is a Orthodox, practicing Orthodox Catholic, another friend who is a Reformed, another friend who's an atheist, right? I have friends who are from a bunch of cultural and ethnic backgrounds, right? There's difference, and postmodernity recognizes that. Is that it says we no longer have these same kind of common centers or stories that we pull from all the time. We can't count on that. Instead, we're in a moment where there's a lot of different social worlds colliding. Yeah. And in the midst of all of that, Barnett, Peirce, and Littlejohn are pointing us to an idea of learning, and they use the term appreciative inquiry, which is to simply approach something new with curiosity, to approach it with appreciation and with valuing it without making prejudgments about it, or about the people who hold those beliefs or backgrounds, but instead being appreciative about it, doing the work of curiosity and trying to understand. Appreciative inquiry is also a form of scholarship that's really interesting. If you have the chance to explore it, it's a way of going into communities and asking questions, not in a way that has the answers already kind of figured out beforehand, but in a way that's genuinely curious and is eager to learn. So in a world of postmodernity where we can't take for granted that we hold things in common with other people, appreciative inquiry gives us the tools to be able to start to understand people and where they're coming from. Communicative gestalt. This is another important phrase, another important term. So communicative gestalt is it's an important term in communication ethics. So with communication ethics, we're looking at the background that people are operating from for decision making, right? So if people are protecting and promoting certain goods, and that's what we're looking at with communication ethics, then is the background that kind of helps them make those decisions? What ground do they stand on, right? And Gestalt theory is concerned with that. Gestalt is the background, right? Whereas the communicative actions are in the foreground. Aristotle in Metaphysics talks about how the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Even this picture here of the camera, you've got the lens, you've got the little buttons, the little screws, all these little pieces, right? And when you pull it all together, it's not just a collection of screws and pieces and doodads, it's a camera, and it does something. And when you start to, if you were just to focus in kind of like really close, like if I'll do this sometimes with students in class, where if you put your hand really close to your face, one, you might go cross-eyed. I do that sometimes, but two, you don't, it doesn't almost really even look like a hand anymore, right? When you get so close to it, all you see is lines and pink and or whatever color your hand is. Mine is a little red today. I was in the sun all weekend. So you're looking at it, you got lines, all right, but it doesn't quite start to look like a hand yet until you pull back a little bit and you start to see the whole thing, right? And you see fingers and you see a hand, right? And so Gestalt theory is looking back. It's taking a step back and looking at the background of communication, the context, to be able to understand the whole better. John Stuart Mill talks about how Gestalt assumes that parts can have different qualities than the whole. Yeah, so yellow and blue equal green, right? When you put them together, but they're also separate, right? So you have yellow on its own, you have blue on its own, but together it's green. When we start to look at Gestalt and we start to take things apart or pull back and see the whole thing, that's a way of countering thoughtlessness and routine perceptions, just assuming that things are the way we think they'll be. And this is something we have the tendency to do. A scholar named Bronwyn Davies talks a lot about this. She's looking at emergent listening is the theory that she works with. And it's this idea of being attentive to new things and not just trying to categorize everything the way we think it works, right? But being willing to admit, hey, we might not understand this yet. Hannah Arendt, I can't remember if we've talked about her yet, but she's a philosopher, a political philosopher from the 20th century who's really important in communication and a bunch of other different disciplines, political philosophy. And she was really interesting. She did a lot of work in continental philosophy, but she kind of took a turn and didn't identify herself as a philosopher. She saw herself more as a political theorist. And she also was a reporter in some ways. She lived in Germany. She was born in Europe. You know, she went to school in Germany, and then she left before World War II broke out. After World War II, she went to Jerusalem, and this was in the 1960s, to cover the trial of a person named Adolf Eichmann. Now, Adolf Eichmann was an influential Nazi who had helped orchestrate the administrative process, all the background, the train tables, the kind of all the logistics of the Nazi concentration camps in World War II, right? Where I think it was almost 6 million Jews perished. And the human cost was just horrendous, right? And he was a key player in this. But Adolf Eichmann had escaped after World War II in all the chaos. I believe he fled to Argentina, somewhere in South America. And in the late 50s or 60s, the Jewish secret intelligence, the Israeli secret intelligence, found him and got him on a plane and took him back to Jerusalem, where he sat on trial for his role in the Holocaust, right, in the Nazi concentration camps. And the trial was publicized all over the world, reporters everywhere, and there were, Hannah Arendt talks about how there was this kind of expectation that Adolf Eichmann, when people saw him on TV or heard about him, that he would be this evil monster, right? This kind of, I mean, what do you picture when you hear of someone who is involved in the death of 6 million people, right? Someone horrible. Like, how could someone be that monstrous? And you'd think there'd be something about them that would give you a hint to how bad they were. But when he came into the courtroom, she said that he was incredibly normal, looking, right? Boring even, right? The kind of person that you might just kind of look over as you're passing by and not think another thing of. He didn't have a black hat with a mustache and a cape or a maniacal laugh. He didn't look like the kind of person who would do the kind of things that he did. And in the trial, she even talks about how over and over again his defense was that he was just simply following orders. He tried to say over and over again that he didn't have any personal animosity or hatred for Jewish people. He talked over and over again about how he was just simply doing his job. He was trying to make things run more efficiently, and that he shouldn't be responsible for what happened and his role in what happened because he was just following orders. And this is something that really disturbed Hannah Arendt because she was observing this unreflective engagement in doing something that was really horrible to other people, but it was not thought out even decades after the fact. He not taking responsibility for what he did, not even able to engage in it. And what she starts to call this whole phenomena is the banality of evil. And the banality of evil is that unreflective engagement in the world can sometimes lead us to doing things that cause a lot of violence and harm simply because we haven't engaged in thinking about it. We haven't engaged in honestly trying to understand the situation or the people in front of us or the consequences of our actions, right? We just follow orders. We just go through the motions, right? And that's what she's concerned about with Adolf Eichmann, is this person who had committed these horrible things. And his excuse was he was simply following orders. There was no responsibility. There was no awareness of the larger picture. And so when we look at communicative gestalt, we look at the whole of the situation where we're communicating, we might start to be able to understand better what's going on and be able to understand where our responsibility lies in the encounters we have with other people. And this starts to point us towards goods that matter, right? The link between communication ethics and conflict assumes that ethical positions give moral height and importance to a given content that propels a dispute. Why do things matter? The things we do, the things we protect and promote, to use language from communication ethics, they matter, right? And when we can identify why those things matter to us or to others, then hopefully we can start being able to better engage in conflict in a way that's respectful of other people and able to articulate our own position. Arnett in 2008 talked about this idea of tainted ground. So tainted ground is a perspective that holds so tightly to one's own perspective that you reject anything else that might contrast or contradict it right off the face of it. Right. There's no room to entertain something. I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where this idea of entertaining other thoughts and being able to admit that you might be wrong. And tainted ground is a position where there's no room for that. There's no room for questioning or reflecting on our own position. That doesn't mean we have to change or that we can't be passionate about what we believe in. It just simply means that we need to be open to understanding why we believe and how we believe it and what we think is important. Alistair McIntyre talks about the concept of narratives, and narratives they're made up of three elements. They're made up of publicly told moral stories, the belief system that we have. They're made up of practices that tie back into those publicly told moral stories, and they're made up of community buy-in, a group of people that believe in those publicly told moral stories and practice the practices. Yeah. So Catholicism is an example of that, of a narrative. And these structures are what we're rooted in, what we're grounded in. They're the gestalt, in some ways, of communication ethics. So as we're going into conflict, we've talked a little bit about this gestalt. We've talked about communication ethics, about narrative, but what kind of responsibility do we have in conflict? especially in public spaces, but also in the family, right? Discourse ethics is concerned with these kinds of questions. Who gets to speak in the public domain, and how should they go about doing that? Hannah Arendt, the person who wrote about Adolf Eichmann, she also talks about this concept of inner spaces. And inner spaces are the places where we interact with people. They're the betweens. Yeah. So I'm sitting at a table right now, and if my wife is sitting on the other end, my brother is visiting us for a little bit. He's sitting over here at the table. Maybe we have a friend over here, and the table is the space between us, right? I have myself, my views, and the way I see the world. My friend has the way they see the world, but this table here, this is the between, right? We have food on the table that we're sharing, right? I ask for somebody to pass the rice or the whatever else we're eating, the bread or the salad, right? And the table is a space between us. It's a place where we're also having conversation, right? And we're able to meet around a table. And we have these inner spaces in the public domain around us, whether it's the people we work with, maybe it's intramural sports. You're in a community soccer team or soccer club, softball team. Maybe it's even coming around like a community council meeting. There's a local hearing to talk about planned road projects or something like that. These are interspaces that we function in. And even in a family, there are interspaces, right? There's the living room where we talk and we hang out, we watch something together, right? And these interspaces for Hannah Arendt need to be protected. They need to be taken care of. And they're especially diminished when someone's vote or voice is discounted, right? So where someone's opinion doesn't matter as much as the other person's, or when their voice is silenced, that's dangerous for Hannah Arendt, not only because of the individual person and the fact that they have dignity and value, but also because it diminishes the inner spaces that we should be protecting, right? When someone's voice is counted as less, that interspace becomes less of an inner space. It's more monopolized. It's more controlled. It can become more dictatorial. It can become unsafe, right? And I think of times as the oldest. I'm the oldest sibling in a family of 9, and my voice is pretty loud. Not only because I'm a big personality, but because I'm the oldest. And so, if I make my voice really loud when we're at family gatherings, if I give my opinion first every time, or I talk the loudest every time, I can easily run over some of my siblings because some of them are a decade or two younger than me, and some of them are quieter, or these other things, and I have to be careful to preserve that interspace when we're hanging out at a family gathering, making sure that I ask questions of the people who are a little quieter, that I'm not the first person to always have an opinion about where we go or what we do or what we eat, right? Because otherwise I start to chip away at the interspaces. Free speech is a universal right. This is something that goes back to chapter 1 and talking about how people have a right to have their voice heard and to have their vote counted. All right. That's part of being human and having inherent value and dignity. Communicative dwellings, these inner spaces, they're invitations. They have an invitation inside of them to keep the conversation going. That's what happens when we preserve these inner spaces, is we preserve the invitation for dialogue, for continued conversation. We've talked about social worlds and about construction and about building the world around us. And this happens in these public spaces, in these inner spaces, as we rub shoulders with one another, as we negotiate meaning, as we reinforce different ideas, right? Communication and conflict begin with an ethical commitment to construct public space where difference prospers. Conflict is expected, and creative learning becomes the norm. When we take care of these inner spaces, there's room for that, room for difference, room for learning, and room for conflict that's handled healthfully. This is especially important in family settings. I think of concepts like face saving, which some of our other books talked about a little bit. Um, talk Talking about these kinds of situations where we give space for other people. Right? I think of my father-in-law. So I have this here in the PowerPoint, and I can't remember if I told this story or not. They start to all jumble together, but the instance was he had made a dish for me that my wife talks about all the time. It's a dish called congee, and it's a rice and kind of meat dish. And she remembers eating it growing up. And he's a little older now, and the dish didn't taste very good when I tried it, but I'd heard so much about it, and it was an important part of my wife's memories. And when he served it to me, I'm so thankful I did this. This wasn't because I was necessarily because I'm great at handling conflict or something like that. It was just that I was aware of the importance of the situation, and I was kind of a little bit more on my best behavior, and I was really attentive to what was needed. But I remember eating it, and I almost had the urge to kind of like, oh, kind of gag a little bit because it really wasn't good. It had been sitting on the stove for a day or two. She had reheated it, and it just was not great. But I took a bite, and I remember eating it, and then I kept eating it, and I finished my plate, and I thanked him afterwards and said, "Hey, thank you so much for making this for us. I've heard so much about this dish, and it was really a special thing to get to try it. Thank you." And he responded by saying, "Oh, it's not that good anymore. I'm almost 80 and I can't cook like I could, but thank you for eating it. And you don't need to finish it like I was finishing the last couple of bites." He's like, "You don't need to finish it." And there's this saving of face that happened, right? Face saving is helping the other person to save their reputation or their kind of dignity in a moment that could cost them face, right? It could cost them their reputation or be embarrassing, right? And we both did that for each other, right? I was able to do that for him by thanking him for the dish, even though it didn't taste very good. And he was able to give me permission to not have to finish it all, and acknowledging kind of under the table that it's not that good anymore, right? But he appreciated it, and I appreciated him in that. So there's those kinds of conversations can be difficult, right? And relational dialectics is another theory that we might talk about a little bit more another time, but this comes from Baxter and Montgomery, and it's this idea of not having to always resolve all of the tensions in all of our relationships all the time, being able to exist in some of those tensions and be able to let them inform us, let them teach us, and let them point us towards communication ethics, or towards the gestalt, the background that's happening behind the scenes, and to be able to learn from those relational tensions, right? And finally, in all of this, there's an importance of distance, of not colonizing the other person, not making them in our own image, but being able to recognize that people are coming from different places. There are different social worlds that are colliding, and we can use those opportunities to learn from each other and hopefully construct interspaces where different ideas and different backgrounds are welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week as we go into Unit 5. Again, reach out if you have any questions. Take care, and we'll stay in touch throughout the week.